My best friend was in Pompeii. I wasn't, of course, or I wouldn't be standing here staring down at a museum display titled A Blast from the Past. A kitsch red LED volcano flickering gently in the background, flinging deep shadows across expressions of abject misery behind a velvet rope for the small children to point sticky fingers at. Speakers rumble in the distance. One little girl bursts into inconsolable howling at the sight, or perhaps it's the ruddy glowering threat that the same's imminent to be visited on us. I like her immensely. Her father carries her out. In fact, some years before Pompeii's last days came about, I had found myself dutifully lugging my scant possessions down the road with tail tucked between my legs, off to marry, of all things. That's what you did back then when your family saw fit to offload you, and should be the match be prestigious enough poof. You were magically absolved of the past to boot, not even the neighbors could sneer behind closed doors anymore. Far away and footsore, then. Out of sour, miserably small mind and all that. The distance didn't matter, of course, my best friend and I were soulmates. I never ventured far before I could feel the line drawing me back in, calling me home. Our simpatico a secret treasure, far too precious to sport on your sleeve because so rare, as much then as now. Women don't ever seem to connect, not truly. They've sharp noses for challenge, and too readily recognize and condemn what lurks within. How are you expected to place faith in a mysterious threatening other when personal trust barely stretches so far as you could throw yourself? But we had somehow weathered that giggly, prickly rivalry of youth when any second double-edged friendship can slide into outright envious warfare, sparking bitter feuds to last the ages. I'd no reason on earth to disbelieve we would hobble on together into our decline, achieving that comfortable state where it no longer matters what hell your crumbling shell resembles or how it's dressed. And then at last two alike minds could tentatively reach out and clasp hands, honoring other, recognizing self. And she helped me. My best friend helped me when nobody else could. There'd not been another soul under all the wide skies like her, the natural outcast, the outsider, none other to so much as recognize my peril. Even I ascertained the threat only vaguely. To me it was no more than a dim line of smoke barely noticed, way off in the distance. Who could see harm in the tiny cough of a newly arrived baby? Advertisement. Afterward, there were never any accusations of crime. Where's the point when it burns in every eye until the very air ignites? For decency's sake I had to abandon home and trudge into the unknown to join some fat bastard I'd never met in holy matrimony. Thus I escaped Pompeii, and so my name has changed over and again along with the multitudes of the living, heaving world. But not so those who were there, left mute and insistent. Not her. And it grieves me deeply to recall how pertly she'd once turned up her nose at donning a nicer dress, at playing along, her flat refusal in short to be any damn thing but herself, because now she never will be. But she remains my best friend. Our hold is firm. Every time I am squeezed into life, thrust out into the world through blood and muck, she is the very first thing I feel, before light, before air. And that's when I remember Pompeii. I even used to hear her murmuring, sealed away down there. So I guess in a way I'm no more than myself, either. They went and dug up the town, many years later, of course. Avid for knowledge, sick enough for sensation to go grubbing around in the dirt. They mixed buckets of cold plaster on site, their improvised wooden paddles going round and round in the thin early Mediterranean light. It would have been hard messy work, arm muscles already burning, shoulders stuffed with ache and complaint. Shoes splattered for the wife to shriek at when they got home. Bite the bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Board articles. With long thin tools they drilled down to Pompeii's lost people, who cried out with joy at that first hint of sunlight and air. Finally, after all this crushing immobile time, there came to the buried hope of rescue, of freedom. I heard my best friend, as the drill wound its way through pumice and compressed ash, while flakes of burned building sifted down onto her. Everyone and their lives were down there, my family, all those sullen despised neighbors, and in fact I've recognized familiar contortions in the frozen grimaces at the museum, but I've never heard any of the others. What do I care for them, anyhow? None of them ever helped me. I heard my friend weeping, too overburdened to bear it. But those who had not yet managed to go mad sealed down in the dark had another thing coming, for in went the plaster. The merest golden hint of the wild free sky gleaming in, oh sweet heaven, yes, deliver us. Do you remember birds? I remember birds, but then a deluge of thick icy cold clotted down the tubing. Salvation was blotted out. Thrashing in the dark, screams turning to heavy choked gurgles as the narrow space filled. The cold was so intense that my breath frosted out of my lungs in a rush, painfully colder than the surrounding air. I was sped to hospital where conscientious staff irrigated my abdominal cavity with warm saline and, when I shuddered and flailed awake, rather gleefully announced that I'd been dead for 4 whole minutes. Gathered excitedly about my bed, they were so very proud of resuscitating me, and didn't at all understand why I wept. Advertisement. I think I tried to rush to my friend and gather her in my arms, straining to pull her from her prison. But 4 minutes was just not long enough. I still heard her shrieking hysterically for succor, as they all must have screamed, those who waited so long in the dark and ought to have been saved. As the frigid killing cold consumed them. Not only a new sensation but a final one, filling up everything until cold was all there was left, and it went on forever. As the plaster stiffened, so did they, and although I still feel her drawing me home, I have heard my best friend's voice no more. She inhabits a hard, silent place in my mind now. And she's so profoundly cold. And I, who deserved it so much less, I have lived my quiet times over and over. Always plagued with poor circulation, chill at the fingertips, at risk of losing them, I gravitate to warmer climes. Never too close to anybody. I have borne children. I've sat blissfully in the sunlight. I visit the museum countless times, to stand and look on my friend's horror-stricken face. All I dare hope is that I might well be unto my best friend as she has been to me. And so the unchanging frozen scar on my soul which is forever entombed may, in her, bloom. Credit to B.P. Gregory. It's Saturday night and I'm home alone playing a video game. Not exactly the exciting partying life you'd expect from a college student, but what else could I do? My parents had a car. In fact, my parents drove off to Maine for a minute vacation, and while I'm heating up a frozen pizza for dinner, they're probably stuffing their faces with lobster. It's okay though, they originally didn't want to go without me when I told them I had an English paper to write this weekend, but I told them I preferred to be alone so I could focus on the paper. I wasn't writing it now, though. It was around 7 o'clock. Not really late, but since it was winter it was already dark out, so I decided to take advantage of the darkness and play my Resident Evil video game. It was a horror, suspense game centered around a zombie infestation, and to maximize my playing experience I always played at night when it was dark out, shutting off all the lights inside, as well as making sure there was no excess noise anywhere. Read, my parents are asleep. It might sound like a stupid thing to do, but you don't know true terror until you're in a dark open space and the only thing visible is your big screen TV showing the zombie slowly limping toward you. So I'm playing my game, sucked up in the moment, and terrified as my character is making his way through an abandoned zombified subway station, when the phone rings from the kitchen and scares me half to death. Thank God my parents put the volume on super extra loud before they left so I wouldn't miss their calls, I thought to myself as I went and got the phone, only to see member Servx show up on the caller ID. I was pretty mad. Not only did these people interrupt my game and scare me, they already called this morning and left a message on the answering machine trying to lower my mortgage interest rate or some bullshit like that. I picked up and before some woman could finish saying hello, I angrily shouted, I'm not interested in lowering my fucking interest rate, you made me die in my game, stop fucking calling my house, and hung up. Since my gaming ritual was disturbed, I took the opportunity to eat the pizza I made and browse the internet for a few minutes, and took the battery out of that stupid phone and threw it across the room. I actually think I broke it. I had to take advantage of being home alone. So I decided to continue playing my game, But a minute after shutting off the lights and getting back into the perfect atmosphere, I heard the sound of my gate opening outside. I paused the game and quietly snuck upstairs to look out the window to try to see who came. Upon looking out, I saw a Con Edison truck double parked outside. I saw a figure make its way back to the front of the house coming from the side, and shrugged it off as a Con Ed employee and doing a scan. Con Edison is our electricity provider and they do that once a month, just come by and scan something on the side of the house to check how much electricity has been used, or so my mom told me once. I continued to spy on the guy, waiting for him to leave, but he paused in front of the house, looking at the device in his hands. After a few seconds, he made his way to the front door and rang the bell. I considered not answering, hoping he'd just leave. Sad to say, but I was a coward. I lived in New York and this guy could be some psychopath trying to kill or rob me. That shit happens all the time here, check the news. After about 30 seconds, he rang the bell again. I built up some resolve. I was a 20-year-old college student, and I was a pretty big guy. Worst comes to worse, I just close the door on him and call the cops. Call from the phone whose battery I just broke. Not a great move considering I left my cell phone in the car, 5 hours away. Besides, this guy probably just wanted to ask a question or tell me something trivial. He worked for Con Ed, for God's sake. I rushed back down to the first floor and opened the window next to the door, casually saying, "Hey, sorry, I was in the bathroom. What's up?" I inspected the guy since I could see his face clearly now. Pretty decent looking guy, he was white and had average brown eyes and unkempt inch-long dark brown hair that was almost black. Maybe it was the lighting, the place was still dark from when I was gaming. He wore what looked like a standard Con Ed uniform and held the scanning device under his arm. Probably around 30 years old. He had a friendly smile and seemed to be full of energy. Despite working so late on a weekend, he probably wasn't married or had any kids. "Sorry to disturb you," he said, "but there seem to be some abnormalities with current running in your house. Can I come in and take a look at your fuse box?" I hesitated. He wanted to come inside. I took another look at his uniform and snuck a glance at his van. After a few seconds I reluctantly muttered, "Yeah, sure." I unlocked and opened the door and ran over to turn some lamps on. The Con Ed guy came inside, pushed the door closed, and enthusiastically said thanks. "I'll try to make this quick." I led him downstairs to the fuse box, and as we passed the TV, with my game still on pause from the phone call, the Con Ed guy said, "Oh wow, Resident Evil. My kid loves this game." Advertisement. I was pretty shocked at this, in a curious way. I stole another glance at this guy's face. He still looked young enough for me to reason that he didn't have kids. Normally I'm not good at judging superficial characteristics, because I just don't pay attention to them, but I really thought I had this guy pegged. Not only did he have more energy than I figured a parent or a young kid could have, but he genuinely looked 30. And since I'd just been playing my game, my observational senses were heightened. Trust me, I was in survive a zombie apocalypse mode. If this guy was 30 like I thought, then his son would be maybe 12 years old, assuming him at age 18. Resident Evil wasn't a game 12-year-olds should be playing. "Oh really?" I feigned innocence. "Do you play with him?" I figure this would give me some indication of how old his son could be. He corrected. "No, she plays on her own." "Oh, I see it." He opened the fuse box and started messing around with its contents. I thought to myself. I hardly encounter female gamers, and definitely not ones who play horror genre, let alone being so young. But whatever. "I'll need to work on this for a bit," the Con Ed guy said as he interrupted my thoughts, and pulled a few tools out of his pocket. He mentioned something about what the abnormality in the current was, but honestly I didn't understand. Bite the bullet sponsored links you may like. The top 12 highest educated countries in the world. Board articles. After a few minutes of awkward silence and me just standing around watching him work, I decided to offer him a beverage. "Could I get you a bottle of water or something?" "Sure, that'd be great," he said. It'll just be a few more minutes. I think I found the problem. I walked upstairs and took my time getting the water. I wasn't in a rush to go back down there with him. When I got the bottle and went back to the stairs, I noticed the front door leading outside was slightly open. The last time I saw the door was when the Con Ed guy came in, and I was sure he closed it. Did someone come in? I looked around first floor and even went upstairs, just half checking upstairs though. It was scary up there in the dark, especially with the thought of a stranger lurking around somewhere, although I strangely took comfort in the Con Ed guy being in the house so that I wasn't alone. I shrugged it off, half hoping it was just my imagination. The thing is, we had Sloman's shield protecting our house, so that if the door was opened the system would make a beeping sound that I would have heard, even from the basement. It was definitely working, because I heard the beep when I opened the door for the Con Ed guy. I closed and even locked the door, and went back downstairs and offered the Con Ed guy his bottle of water. He seemed to be finished, since he was putting his tools back into his pocket. "Thanks," he said as I gave him the water. After drinking a bit, he said I fixed the problem, everything should be running smoothly now. Advertisement. "Well, thanks then," I said, leading the way back upstairs. I wondered if things weren't running smoothly all this time. Everything seemed fine. The microwave was weaker than usual, we had to heat things up longer than we normally would, but we just attributed that to the microwave being 5 years old and needing replacing. My mind already off this night's interruption, I started considering whether or not I should continue to play my game or if I should work on my paper, when what I saw something bewildered me. The front door was slightly open again. The door pushed opened slowly. Why didn't the alarm make its usual beep? A young woman around my age entered, wearing the same uniform as the Con Ed guy, but it looked too big for her. She glanced behind me before looking at me, but when our eyes locked she drew a hideous contorted smile on her face. I froze. The combination of her evil gaze and the presence of the man behind me filled me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I slowly backed my way into a wall so that they were both in my field of vision. The man stood in place looking at me, but he lost the energy he carried before. He looked older, his face now visibly worn from age. He was no longer smiling. He had a serious, almost sad look in his once vibrant eyes. Turning my attention back to the woman who closed the distance between us, I noticed both of her hands held something. In one hand she held a gun, and in the other hand she held a cell phone that had a case eerily similar to mine. "What do you want?" I asked in desperation. "Don't worry, sweetie," the woman's familiar voice said as she held the gun up and released the safety. "We're not here to lower your interest rates." Credit to Tariq interest rates. Credit to Tariq. You lay in your bed quietly. Your window is open, a light breeze flowing through. You stare up at the ceiling, watching time pass by. Why is it so hard to sleep? You silently wonder, tapping your heel impatiently, waiting for oblivion to overcome you. You haven't been able to sleep for ages, and it's been almost 3 days since you got some shut-eye. Laying here, your senses are heightened, the quiet rustling and hooting of the occasional owl ringing in hypersound. Your eyes have fully adjusted to the dark, allowing you to see every detail in the bedroom around you. You suddenly hear a creak. Thinking it's just your dumb dog walking around at night, you push your head under your pillow and groan. Another creak, followed by a crash. You jump up, grabbing the gun from your bedside table. "Who the hell is there?" you shout, aiming around the room wildly. Advertisement. There is something out your window. It crawls through the hole, its face white, with singed black brows and a bloody red smile. Its hair is long, black, and matted. It wears a white hoodie, smeared with black substance you can only guess to be blood. It rushes in on you, tackling and ramming you into the bed, hissing 4 words into your ear. Just go to sleep. You look up into the thing's eyes, and you push yourself up, staring at it. Who the hell do you think you are? Barging into my room like this? Bite the bullet. Sponsored links you may like. Have debt? 3 ways you can still buy a home. SunTrust Mortgage. The thing stares at you. Wait. What? You stare at it angrily. And why the fuck did you tell me to go to sleep? I mean, for all I know, I might have just been about to drift off, but nah, you have to go show up. You plop the gun onto your desk and lay back down on the bed, sighing and speaking aloud. Jesus. People these days. Hours have gone by, with nothing. I've typed the same shit over and over, which is getting me nowhere. It's time to get something done. Smith, before I go further with this, I want to establish how much I hate you. Although, in a sense, I'm proud of you. This trap is rather elaborate, and even uses my own idea against me. You've thought around every corner to ensure my suicidal demise in the end, and for that, I commend you. How long you'll go on is lost to me. I'm not sure how, but perhaps this log will be recovered, and someone else will want to dent your face in. You may have gone years without being caught, but you won't continue much longer. Not like this. I'll try to be sure of it. Now, with my personal message out of the way, I'm not sure where to begin. I have what feels to be all the time in the world, yet that's not something I can be sure of. For some time, I've been oblivious to the loss of blood from my wrist. It wasn't apparent until the pain began to set in, but it's been slow. I'm hoping I can at least keep alive until this is finished, wherever it may be going. I apologize for any blatant typos or unfixed errors. A perfect paper isn't my highest objective at the moment. I'll start by talking about him, I suppose. Smith. We worked for a time, but we never shared a friendship. Our relationship was strictly business. We never met outside our work, and left much of our personal lives undisclosed. Knowing of his past could have surely prevented this, at least this outcome. I work at a Massachusetts General Hospital, by the way. My occupation is a general researcher, but I had a bit of a side interest, which Smith apparently shared. As I delved into the medical research field, I began a fascination with technological enhancements. It was more of a fantasy to me, a strange world that I dreamed of and sketched throughout the day. For Smith, it was essential, to say the least. It was his pursuit. It was his obsession. The first day Smith confronted me was while I was on break. At the time, I believed he was actually working at Mass General. However he sneaks about, he must be good at it. Smith was drawn in by a sketch of mine. It was a undeveloped, spur-of-the-moment idea, a wrist device, similar to a watch, that could regulate areas of the body by injecting various chemicals into the bloodstream. In theory, it could adjust body heat, maintain blood sugar levels, keep its user alert and awake, or vice versa. It was another fantasy to me, as I would never have the time or resources to construct such a piece. Smith, on the other hand, saw potential in it. Him and I chatted for a while, about our similar views on the concept. It's hard for me to say this now, but at the time, I found him to be quite an engaging man to speak with. His insights into this world of technology were beyond any that I had heard. He's the only individual I've ever spoken to who looks at tech enhancements as a real using possibility. From that day, we scheduled various dates in which we worked on the prototype device. Smith was rather paranoid of ideas being stolen, so we kept our location and progress quiet from other researchers. We worked at his apartment, which was secluded enough. Throughout the project, Smith never stopped encouraging me, if encouraging would be an appropriate word. It appeared to be the only matter he focused on, annoyed that I didn't feel the same. Yes, I thought the project had potential, but I still had a job to keep, at the very least. This frustrated him, for sure. It was clear that Smith knew far more on this subject than myself. He constantly spoke about how he's worked with tech for years. After only a week's worth of collaborating, I wanted out, but was unsure of how to go about telling him. After all, he grew angry if I even questioned him. Abandoning him wouldn't be much more promising. Goddamn. The pain's worse now, for sure. Maybe the wound's worse than I thought. I'll state that I had one major interest outside of tech enhancements. Over the years, I've developed an interest for writing. When I think about it, my interest in the latter came from my writing, as the idea started out just story notes. I never explained this to Smith, for reasons that I hope I've made apparent. Naturally, the project with Smith had taken up most, if not all, of my time outside work. Smith practically forced me to meet with him whenever I could. If I began to refuse, he would interrogate me, asking me about my life, what I could possibly be doing in place of our progress. I'll admit, he frightened me. I'm not sure what exactly about him was unsettling, but he seemed capable of pushing to the end, meeting his goals at whatever costs. I'll leave out the time in between, but before I left the project, we had made progress. Though we still were nowhere close in finishing the prototype device, we had made much ground in getting its basic functions working. The only reason I stayed was because of the device itself, that my fantasy sketch might just become a real, working tool. Then, all our progress was shattered. Unsurprisingly, Smith grew impatient. Despite our progress, he wasn't yet satisfied. He wanted the device fully operational, right away. He began to tamper with the delicate piece. His hands were shaking, jolting with various screws and micro-sized vials. He began screwing with the device's code, ultimately erasing hours of work, and rendering the technology near useless. Advertisement. He blamed me for our failure, of course. I tried to argue how it was his own fault, but this only sent him off more. "What have you fucking done?" he screamed. "You've never cared about this from the start, have you? This was just some fucking drawing that you made, that I wanted to see for real. This is the stuff I live for. I've done this before. I've created my own inventions, and tested them. What have you done?" He grew violent, making threats and throwing objects about. Needless to say, I didn't want any part of him anymore. I left on the spot. I continued with my regular job, and found a peace of mind again. Smith's threats continued to echo in memory, however, as they were too sinister to be passed off. 4 days after I abandoned the project, I was approached by 2 men. Where they came from, I didn't know, but they were investigators. They asked if I'd see Smith, as they'd been tracking him for a long time. I told them a bit of what I knew, and what followed was a long, tedious interrogation. Eventually, when they knew they'd been told everything, they told me the truth about Smith. Smith Alexander wasn't lying when he said he'd done this before. Despite meeting me in the hospital, and describing his job, he's never worked there in his life. He's never worked in any hospital, or any medical or science profession. He slid and faked his way about the systems for years, with almost no one catching on. As unsettling as it is for an impersonator to be creeping his way about a medical facility, it was his reasons for being there that set me off. He was looking for live subjects, injured individuals for him to test his designs. He scanned businesses, schools, and public areas to find a wide array of experimental material. In short, he used people as human test dummies. What he did with his captives ranged from lethal to vomit-inducing. The investigators told me some reports, as well as showed me some photos. He loved to tamper with the heart, resulting with some of his less brutal murders. However, his psychotic designs had no limits. Some of the photos showed a man with both his arms sawed off, with metal rods replacing the limbs. Another photo showed a woman with her back flayed open, syringes lining her spine, which had turned a sickly black color. He didn't discriminate when it came to his victims. I stopped looking at the photos when they started included children. I'm getting drowsy now. Fuck. I should at least get to my own predicament, before I end. Last night, I was working on a novel of mine, right inside my apartment. It was still unfinished, but I was closing in on its conclusion. Despite the confidence, a lack of rest got the better of me, and I drifted into sleep right at the desk. Bite the bullet sponsored links you may like. Flights in Vietnam at ridiculously low prices. Save 70. Fuck. I just realized that I may have been knocked out by the water I was drinking at the desk. It had an interesting taste to it, but my focus was devoted to writing. Smith must have slipped in here before and drugged the glasses. I need to keep on subject. I awoke this morning, right in my apartment, at my desk. The computer screen blared in front of my eyes, which showed a blank page. My ears were greeted with 2 words. Start typing. A cold, narrow shaft bumped against my head. The voice was familiar, but given that I woke up seconds before, my mind was still dazed and unfocused. Start typing, damn it, the voice shouted, with a cold surface being pressed against me. The voice was Smith, and he was holding a pistol to my skull. Smith, I said, beginning to wake. What the hell are? Type, or your face will be smeared on the monitor. I listened, despite my confusion. Slews of letters appeared on the screen, as I was only complying for my life. There, he said. This is what you wanted, correct? You wanted to write? I knew it was your hobby. I've seen you work like this a number of times. Now that you're out of the project, you have all the time in the world, right? Smith reached over my shoulder, towards my right arm. He pressed a small button on a watch, which was secured on my wrist. I hadn't noticed it until he reached for it. Don't stop now, he said. I'll explain your situation, that's it, by the way. Your design. I made it possible, all without your help. It's a prototype, as it only has one feature. It's connected to the keyboard that you're using now. More importantly, its needle is connected to your bloodstream. Fiddle with it, or stop typing for more than 10 seconds, then it will send a small dose of lethal poison into your system. Your heart, along with everything else, will die in less than a minute. All you have to do to prevent that, is just keep typing. Keep typing to your heart's desire. You're fucking crazy, I screamed, smashing the keyboard with a fist. Don't type too aggressive, now. That keyboard breaks, then so do you. Before you get any clever exploits in mind, I've wired the keyboard to the watch in specific ways. Tricks such as weighing down the keys or holding down one letter won't work. Don't bother with trying to get up, either. I've removed all the phones from this room, and there's no inhabited room nearby in the building. Help is unreachable, unless you run out of this room. If you wish to attempt a suicidal escape, by all means, go ahead. Advertisement. You won't get away with this, you sick fuck. Someone will come for me eventually, and I'll tell them everything. Perhaps they will, but will you go on that long? I guess that's up for you to find out. Now please, continue to write. I won't distract you any longer. Enjoy your session, David. And with that, the bastard walked out. If I had to guess, he's still been uncaught. That was about 6 hours ago, if I've been keeping track of time right. He's right when he said there's no way out of this. I've been here continuously writing and deleting the same shit, trying to think of a plan. He's left every crack sealed, as far as escape goes. Despite his warning, I actually did try screaming for help earlier, and no one's shown since then. After hours of useless plans, I knew the best, and only, course of action would be to write my own, final chronicle. I've explained a story, and the trap, so I suppose the only part left is the warning. God damn it. My wrist is fucking killing me at this point, and the pains moved up towards my shoulder. It's painful to lift my right fingers, let alone my arm. Smith's rushed most of his prototypes, and this ON was no exception. Even if I keep going, I'm sure I'll die from blood loss soon. Over the course of typing this, I've found the best loophole available. The computer's locked on this text program, but I can still send out the document directly from it. I'm going to think of every address I can remember, even ones of those I don't know personally. My name is David Mallory. Smith Alexander is most likely still out there, wherever he may be. He probably skipped this town right after trapping me here. He's dangerous, to say the least. He uses random people as test material in his terrible, rush ideas. He's created devices to kill, like the one clasped to my wrist right now. I don't know what his end goal is, but he's had no problem murdering so far. End goal. That needs to be said. He must be stopped. Despite Smith's impatience, arrogance, and outright insanity. He has a plan. Over the course of working with him, he's made hints to something bigger, more significant than his regular, brutal enhancements. He talked about how he planned to bless society with a grand technology, a modification that would be to all, for all. He even talked about how he would sneak it into circulation. Whether it's a virus, nano-sized tech, a fucked up drug, I don't know. But whatever twisted vision it is, Smith's capable of it. He's been capable of all the violence he's committed so far, and he's a danger to anyone at this point. If he's got away with his crimes so far, what's to stop him now? That's it, for me. I've gotten out all I can in this little time. Fuck you, Smith. Goddamn it, fuck you. 6 pains moving towards my chest now, my heart. I guess this watch didn't work as well as Smith thought. By the time I put in the addresses and send this out, I'll be close to keeling over. I'll let the poison take me, then. She'll just be less painful, I hope. Forget about me, my lifey. Remember Smith, though. Remember his atrocities that I've detailed, that he's still out there. And he's still working. Credit to Imre, Richard S. Credit to Imre, Richard S. Credit to. I looked down at Juliet lying in my lap. Her quiet form was beyond angelic. It was a little early for her to be sleeping, but I just couldn't bring myself to move her. My little angel, she had such a hard day. Not only was she sick earlier today, but her father walked out on us. My husband just left. He packed his clothing and left. There was no preamble. There was no warning. He just walked out, a hardened look on his face. Our marriage was strained at best. The conversations we carried rarely lasting more than a few brief moments, but the one thing we could agree on was our daughter. Juliet was the light of our lives. I sat on the couch reminiscing about our dying marriage, while gently stroking her baby fine hair. I looked down at her. Her hair was the color of mahogany. The same color as her father's. A tear escaped my eye, gently landing on her face. All the while thinking more and more on what I had failed at. We were fighting all the time, until we finally snapped. The fight was as volatile as it could be without fists flying. I stormed off to my daughter's room to comfort her crying. Giving her more Benadryl to help with her cough, I held her in my arms. She went to sleep, her breathing slowed, and she was out. Resting her head in my lap, I sat there for hours, staring at the wall. How could my husband leave me? We were everything to each other. He will be back, I know this in every fiber of my being. I continue to stroke Juliet's hair. My husband would be back, I keep repeating this internal mantra. Over and over, for what seemed like hours or days, I continue to repeat this. Advertisement. This whole fight, everything, was all over him having another mistress. I was getting him back, one way or another. With no regard to anything that anyone would say or do, I would get my husband back, at no expense. He had no choice. I knew he would be back, he was mine. No one else could stake that claim to him, I would never allow it. My daughter stirred in my lap, and looked up at me with sad eyes. He is not coming back, Mommy. Her voice, like 1,000 angels speaking at once, both comforted me and broke my heart. My perfect angel lay her head back down in my lap just as it was before. Bite the Bullet sponsored links you may like. The Rise of Solo Travel, Global Traveler. Global Traveler. The sound of banging on the house door registered to my mind, yet I could not focus on it. Still I continued to stroke my daughter's hair. The footsteps racing down the hall still were ignored by my mind. My angel lay still in my lap, the poor thing. The door to the room we were sitting in was busted down, and rushed by a group of men in SWAT gear. I couldn't hear the screaming. Juliet's words were still ringing in my ears. He is not coming back, Mommy. The officers swarmed me. They took my baby from my lap. I know I screamed, I wanted my husband. Where was he? They took the empty bottle of Benadryl off of the nightstand. They continued to yell at me, while gently placing my child into a black bag. Advertisement. My poor baby, she had such a hard day. She was sick, her daddy left us. However, I know she is happy. As often happens with children her age, she was wrong. I know she was wrong. Her daddy does not love his mistress. He is mine. My sweet angel, she had such a hard day. Tomorrow will be better, I know her daddy will come back. I continue to smile lovingly at her as the man zippers up the black bag she is in. Her daddy will be back. He is mine. Credit to Ariana. Hell is worse than you think, trust me. I know this sounds odd, I mean, the idea of an eternal hell being ripped apart over and over by demons sounds horrific, but that image is just stereotypical. Believe me, it can be a lot worse than simply dealing with a whole load of pain. Don't get me wrong, that version of hell is horrific. But I'd gladly swap that eternity with mine. You see, hell is personalized to you. Hell delves into your thoughts and unlocks your deepest and darkest fears, your flaws, and your nightmares. It turns these into reality, the most horrific and twisted kind of reality you could imagine. You relive this reality over and over and over. I'm going to describe my own version of hell to you, seen as though I cannot know for sure what others have experienced. Throughout my life I was a criminal. I have robbed many banks in my time. I have even murdered a few people in the process, not that I wanted to, they simply got in the way. There was something about stealing that gave me a burst of adrenaline. This adrenaline felt good, it made me feel alive, unstoppable almost. Even as a child I have vague memories of stealing sweets from my local convenience store, pocketing them and quietly sneaking out, smiling to myself. Back then I was never detected. In my adulthood as well I managed to slip away from the police many times. My luck ran out at the age of 45. I was caught and arrested, imprisoned for 20 years, not only for robbing banks, but for the murders as well. I was just glad it wasn't a life sentence. 20 years is bad, but at this point I had known something was going to catch me eventually. The stealing was an addiction. Even with the knowledge that I would be caught sooner or later, I simply couldn't bring myself to stop. It was as if I had already accepted the fact that I had used up my life in this way. There was nothing I could do now to change it. Prison was a horrible experience. I aged into an old man. My outlook on the world seemed to change as I watched the sun set every day through those dull gray bars. Stealing slowly became pointless to me. The idea of robbing now didn't appeal to me at all. Even though I had now, in a way, changed as a person, the damage had already been done. A lifetime of stealing and killing could not go unnoticed. Somewhere down south a special someone had made a note of my name, had smiled an evil smile and doomed me to an eternity of torture. Back in real life however the thought of hell was never on my mind. The principal reason for this of course would be that I was an atheist. Why would I have been afraid of something I didn't believe in? That was ludicrous. Anyway, the story continues when I was finally released from prison. I had never attained a wife during my life. I had had a couple of girlfriends as a young man, but I suppose a criminal lifestyle didn't appeal to many women. I died as an old man in a rocking chair, alone by the fire. So that was my life, my quick, pointless life. After being here for an eternity any life becomes meaningless eventually. I've been here so long I'm surprised I can still remember it. Perhaps I am being forced to recall it every day, an extra little torment on top of the torture, knowing that I am now powerless to change my mistakes. Now however my life has become almost non-existent, a brief flash in my memories. I'll always feel the regret through, the overwhelming feeling of regret that consumes my mind, wishing with all my being that I could have been a better man. But there's no going back now. Something I haven't mentioned yet is I am a vegetarian. A vegetarian, it sounds odd, doesn't it? When you think about it. This hard, murdering back robber disliked eating meat, disliked hurting animals. This is what my personalized hell endorsed. This is the weakness that it plucked out of my head when I entered hell. It used my vegetarian nature as my personal torture device, something to torment me with for an eternity. So, I will now describe exactly what happened when I closed my eyes for that final time, exactly what happened when I lay back in my rocking chair by the fire and as a used-up old man closed my eyes forever. I awoke, opened my eyes, breathed in the air. The first thing I noticed was that I felt healthier than I had been in years. I felt like a young man again, with new vigor and energy. Sure enough, as I had looked down and examined my hands, I noticed that my wrinkles, arthritis, everything had simply gone. At first I had been overjoyed, yelping with happiness, punching the air. I believed that I was in heaven. I'd felt better than I had in years, overwhelmed with a feeling of happiness. This temporary feeling subsided slightly when I realized where I was standing. I was in a room, a dark room with bluish walls. The floor and ceiling bore the same characteristics, dark cracked brick which lacked windows, doors, anything. There weren't any lights either, which caught me as unseen as though I could see quite easily, despite being confined in such a sheltered room. "Hello?" I asked out loud. It was then that I noticed the deafening silence, a concrete quiet that made my ears ring. After a while I began to feel ill, started contemplating all the possible places I could be. Was this heaven? Was this a temporary holding place? Was this hell? I tried to keep myself occupied by feeling along the walls, looking for any sign of a way out. Doing nothing in an empty room would have soon driven me to insanity. Advertisement. Mio 1. A voice rang out, making me jump. It was a low, monotonous voice of a man. It echoed around the empty room. "Hello?" I said in response, hoping that perhaps someone had come to collect me. Hoping that someone had perhaps arrived to take me away from this claustrophobic place. I was wrong, however, for no one appeared, a door didn't open, no angel came in with a smile to greet me. Instead, a metal platter appeared in the middle of the room, on it, a piece of cooked meat. A sickness settled in my stomach as I crept over to the plate. It looked like lamb. It was at this point that I hoped I was dreaming. I hoped that I was still an old man in my rocking chair. That I had perhaps simply drifted off to sleep by the fire and was having some sort of vivid nightmare. A very, very vivid nightmare. "I don't eat meat," I whimpered. I was a vegetarian, after all. The idea of eating meat was disgusting. Not only the fact that it came from an animal, but also the taste. There was something about it that had just never appealed to me. Something about the idea that an animal was killed to provide me with a meal, that I was chewing on its insides, its muscle. Muscle that was perhaps used by the animal several weeks earlier to potter around a field chewing on grass. Without warning I suddenly fell to my hands and knees in front of the plate. This shocked me. It felt like I had lost all control of my body, as if something was driving me. So, unable to stop, my hands reached forwards and plucked the lamb off the plate. I tried desperately to resist, but my hands stuffed the meat into my mouth. My mouth then started chewing as if by itself. I choked several times, reeling from the taste I had always been disgusted by. My throat swallowed the dry lamb and I coughed several times, choking on its dry texture. After it was won, my body was released from control and I fell backwards onto the cold ground. The platter that had held the meat seemed to melt away into the deep cracks of the floor, trickling away like water. "What is this?" I shouted. My protest was met with two words from the deep-voiced man. "Bite the bullet." Sponsored links you may like. The top 12 highest educated countries in the world. Board articles. Meal 2. I watched the ground in front of me with hushed trepidation. What would appear there? More meat? No, it was worse. After several moments a small bird appeared, a small robin with closer inspection. It flapped its wings but remained standing, looking at me with its black beady eyes. "No!" I screamed. I stood up and ran to one wall, pressing my back against it. "No! This can't be happening." The small robin simply stared at me, making no effort to fly away. For a fleeting moment the little bird seemed to look malicious, evil almost. As if the bird was in on all of this nightmare, knowing what was happening to me. It took me a while to realize that my body was moving on its own again. I had pulled myself away from the wall and was now taking footsteps towards the bird. I squinted my eyes shut, hoping to somehow wake up, hoping that this was indeed just a horrifically vivid dream. My eyes, however, were suddenly wrenched open again by some invisible force. I had no control, and I couldn't do anything to stop what happened next. My hand reached forward and picked the robin up. It struggled in my hand, flapped its wings frantically. Unable to stop, my hand slowly moved towards my mouth. The head of the robin slid between my teeth. I could feel its beak tapping against them, pecking my gums. Without warning, my jaw clenched shut with supernatural force and the little bird was killed instantly, its neck broken. The blood from its neck oozed into my mouth, the copper taste covering my tongue. I gagged several times and then my hand proceeded to force the rest of the bird into my mouth, causing me to choke. I began chewing, the bird crunched as I did. Blood oozed from my lips and trickled down my chin, soaking into the top of my shirt. Chewing through the feathers was tough, they became stuck between my teeth. When my throat had swallowed the robin, the control was released from me yet again. I collapsed to the ground moaning. It was at this point that I began crying, sobbing loudly, a grown man reduced to tears. I retched a couple of times and vomited on the ground, coughed, choked. I was a mess. And it was only meal 2. Meal 3. The man's voice rang out once again. Advertisement. Shut up. I screamed at the top of my voice, shut up. I knew it was pointless yelling, but did so anyway. I refused to look at what had appeared in the middle of the room. I closed my eyes. By now I realized I was in hell, or something similar. At this point I didn't want to be conscious, I didn't want to be here, I desired to simply cease to exist. An eternity of nothingness was heaven in comparison to this. Desperate, I covered my eyes with my hands and adopted a fetal position. Hoping that somehow I'd be taken away from here, hoping that I'd simply lose consciousness. It was then that I heard it. A bleeding noise. I knew without looking that there was a lamb standing in the middle of the room. I screamed wordlessly, mindlessly, crazily. I had been in this place for what? 10 minutes? I was already bordering on delirium. But there was something inside me that kept me awake. Kept me from feeling tired, passing out, dying, going insane. This was the same force that was now making me walk towards the lamb. It was keeping me grounded in the room, and it didn't want me to escape, physically or mentally. I dropped to my knees in front of the animal, my hand slowly reached out and grabbed it around the middle. I brought it up to my face and my teeth plunged into its neck. I must have severed an artery because blood began pumping into my mouth. The lamb bleated frantically, kicking its legs. My arms kept it in place however, and I drank its blood like a carnivore, being forced to guzzle it. I kept wanting to lose myself to insanity, to get away from this, but something kept bringing me back again and again. Every time I teetered on the brink of fainting, something suddenly snapped me back to my sense, back into the room where I was forced to experience the torture. My teeth began chewing through its neck, the lamb quietened down, it was dead. My body forced me to eat the lamb whole, crunching through its bones. My teeth were chipped and splintered in the process, my gums began bleeding. Throughout all of this I kept throwing up, vomiting all over the half-eaten lamb. I was still unable to stop however, I simply began eating the vomit-drenched carcass, and this in turn made me vomit even more. Throughout this ordeal I had been crying the entire time, sobbing. By the time I was finished and released from the control, I slumped backwards onto the floor, moaning like an animal. Moaning in pain, in pure misery. I was covered in blood, and bits of bone. Some entrails covered the ground, the stench was horrible, making me gag. I dragged myself away from the pool of blood to one side of the room and leaned my back against a wall. "I'm sorry," I cried, "I'm sorry. I hope that somehow my sins would be forgiven due to my sudden apology, that somehow whatever was holding me would become compassionate and free me from this nightmare. In all my time here however nothing I have ever uttered has ever been met with any sort of sympathy. The response to my pleas always consists of 2 words. 2 words that have now consumed my life, my thoughts, my existence. Meal 4. The voice sounded once again. I moved my eyes over to the center of the room reluctantly. By now I was a mess of blood, vomit, tears, and saliva. My teeth were broken and cracked, my gums were torn apart and bleeding. I glanced at what now occupied the center of the room. What I saw made me burst into sobs, into misery-filled sobs. Then I started screaming again, screaming insanely, for what now occupied the center of the room was a human being, an adult man, but not any adult man. It was an exact copy of myself, grinning evilly in my direction. And as I pulled myself up from the wall and slowly approached him for my next meal, as my teeth plunged into his shoulder, the man let out a deep, long laugh. Hell is worse than you think, trust me. Credit to Meek, trust me. Credit to Meek, trust me. I recall when we first found the grove. The trees glowed, illuminated by late sunlight coming in shafts down into the valley, the thick smell of decaying fruit rising up toward us, sweet and sour and wonderful. I was part of a 6-person research team looking into water quality fluctuations in the Sierra Valley system, following watercourses and comparing their biodiversity. In pursuit of one specific stream, we'd squeezed through a narrow crevice canyon that eventually opened up into a verdant, enclosed ecosystem rich with plants and animals previously unknown to science. That sort of thing isn't unheard of in the region. The Andean mountains are full of such tiny pockets of life, totally cut off from each other by high mountain walls, creating Galapagos-like isolation. But the trees, those really were the discovery of a lifetime, for any botanist or explorer, and I was both. The local natives, Puruha, called them witchberries, or something like that, according to our guide. I speak very little Quichua, so I had to trust his translation. It's not an unfitting name, though. They were bewitching. Endemic to just one valley in Ecuador, which was later made into a protected reserve, the small trees were not only beautiful, with arching, pendulous boughs and long, distinctive leaves, green above and pink below, but they also produced flowers and fruit in amazing quantity. Walking into the grove, the berries were everywhere, emitting a heavenly scent, and we could not resist sampling, even knowing we risked poisoning. Taking some back to camp, they were run through our field toxicity test without any problems, and after we'd gone several days without any ill effects, we went back to the grove and picked hands full of the fragrant fruit. Orange-pink, grape-sized oblong berries with a thin, fig-like skin, and a ripe mango texture. And the flavor, like burnt brown sugar and melted butter drizzled on perfect strawberries. They also dried easily, and held up unrefrigerated for nearly a week before spoiling. Almost immediately, talk of cultivation and marketing overtook our discussions. We foresaw witchberries being the next big thing in supermarkets all across the world, and our visions soon danced with the money to be made. The Puruha didn't seem too happy about us taking branch samples or eating from the trees. No doubt we were offending their religion and angering their gods somehow. They had some sort of taboo about eating the fruits raw, which we didn't understand, and dismissed as superstition. They used the berries for various medicinal and ceremonial purposes, cooking, drying, and grinding the fruit into a fine powder. It was easy to categorize their relevance as being similar to other cultures' superstitions about pomegranates, apples, or honey. So we took the cuttings back to our greenhouses in Kent, only to be pleasantly surprised by how readily they rooted and grew, thriving in warm, humid shade. Inside of 5 years, they started flowering, and we arranged an industry party to celebrate and taste the first crop grown in the UK. I lost track of how many people shook my hand, congratulated me and my teammates, and gushed positively about our find. Oh, but of course, we couldn't say we discovered the plant. The indigenous people of the region knew about them long before us, and we had already made plans to send a small portion of the profits from our venture to the Puruha, to improve their lives and to protect the tiny valley the trees came from. The tasting party went off without a hitch, and we got a plethora of preliminary offers, not only from within the UK, but Europe and the USA as well. Of course, the fruit still needed FSA approval, but since the trees produced year-round with sufficient fertilizer, we could start shipping as soon as we were certified. Since our own labs had already investigated them pretty thoroughly, we knew it wouldn't be a long process. With luck, we'd be able to get the next crop out by December, just in time for the big rush on tropical fruit for the holiday season. And when the certificates arrived, I brought in some champagne for us all. We were, of course, fools. Not stupid, we were all educated scholars. Well, except Paul Dimsey, he was a photographer. But no amount of research or knowledge could have prepared us for the worst. I, in particular, was so blinded by fortune and success that even when I saw the signs that something was wrong, I didn't pay attention to them. I didn't want to. And for that I take full responsibility. There's a disease called pica that affects people with certain neurological conditions or dietary deficiencies, and it is characterized by the sufferer eating non-food items or substances. In some cases, pennies, buttons, small sundry objects. In others, clay or dirt. It was the latter that I caught Nick blessed up to in the greenhouse, perhaps 3 days after we'd packed our first shipment and kissed it goodbye. He was eating the moist black soil straight out of a large plastic bag, and when he saw me watching him, he immediately stopped, guilty-faced and stuttering. He called me Miss Torgerson, instead of my first name, and tried to hide what he had been doing. I asked him if he was feeling alright, and he abashedly admitted to me he'd had the condition his entire life, it just happened to come and go at odd times. I told him I understood, though really, I was surprised. He'd never mentioned it, and he'd always seemed very open and jovial about his life. But then, I'd reasoned, some people act that way to better hide their secrets. Still, something felt off about the entire thing. I regretted not listening to my instincts when Dr. Hanlon came to my apartment a little less than a week later. He asked to come in, and I offered him a drink. "Bless you, girl," he said, and I poured us whiskey on the rocks. We weren't best friends, but we'd spent a lot of time talking on our trip. I think our mutual love of a good bottle pushed us into each other's company. The others in our team didn't drink, and didn't find our rowdiness after a few as mutually endearing as we did. Dr. Hanlon, Eugene outside office hours, hadn't come for my delightful presence, but to talk to me about something far more problematic. He asked me if I had felt any strange urges recently, for example, the urge to eat anything unusual. Eugene was edging around the true crux of his question, so I supplied it for him. Advertisement. "You mean like soil?" As I said it, his face stiffened. I'd hit the bullseye. I told him I'd walked in on Nick earlier, and he nodded, then told me it wasn't just the one. He liked to sneak into the greenhouses for a tipple here and there between his appointments, and he'd spied 3 people, all members of our expedition, snacking on black humus. We discussed the situation for a good long while, consuming half of my bottle of Glenfiddich. The possibility of having brought back with us some exotic tropical parasite came quick to our minds, though Eugene and I weren't experiencing any odd urges yet. Still, I was worried, and saw the clinic as soon as they were open the next morning. I went back to the campus in the afternoon, to ask Eugene to help me convince the rest of the expedition team to get themselves tested. There was initial resistance. Everyone seemed to feel fine, even those who we knew were snacking out of the garden bed. Especially those, which just made us more worried. Our concerns were taken seriously by the department head, who ordered mandatory testing for everyone who'd been on the expedition, as well as anyone who'd been in extended contact with us, or been in the greenhouses for any length of time. Everyone in the department submitted to various scans and samplings without argument, including the soil eaters, their smiles so certain that nothing was amiss. And they seemed to be right. There was nothing new or unusual in any of their samples, no strange bacteria, viruses, nematodes, no extreme nutritional elevations or deficiencies, nothing to indicate why some of them were having such odd cravings. Testing did reveal those who were affected. Grabbing dirt is hard to miss. 7 people came up positive for soil eating. which meant that whatever it was had spread to at least 4 people who had not gone to Ecuador with us. Suddenly, the situation was far more serious. If the disease could be spread, it could get out, and nobody had any idea what it was, or how it was transmitted. More people started showing symptoms, some reporting right away, others only admitting their condition after they'd succumbed to dirt hunger. All the while, the lab techs ran themselves ragged looking for an explanation, but it was only after ruling out just about every cause for the symptom they could think of, that one of the techs finally noticed something common to those who'd been afflicted: witchberry. Well, we'd all been eating them. Some more than others, apparently. But these folks most of all. More specifically, they were finding lots of chewed seeds in the subject's stool. When asked about it, all of the unaffected said that they specifically avoided eating the seeds, while the others did not. So we had an obvious suspect, but we'd waited too long before looking at the fruit. Hundreds of pounds had already been shipped all around the world, and while we could shut down the farm and stop production, a recall and the potential panic it could cause seemed unreasonable. If we could just figure out how to mitigate the effects, maybe the situation could be salvaged. And then the symptoms just went away. The dirt eaters' cravings evaporated a few days after they'd stopped eating the fruit, starting with those who developed them first. They'd experienced some mild withdrawal symptoms, but it seemed the problem had resolved itself. Still, we had a lot of work on our hands. If it was just the seeds that were the problem, we could deal with that. All was not yet lost. So we halted shipping, and on the advisement of our legal department, sent out a statement advising people not to eat the seeds, or, if they had already been eating seeds, to stop doing so. Arrangements were coming along nicely to buy a modified olive pitting machine that would target and delineate the problem area. A lot of our profits were going down the crapper, since cut fruit wasn't as shelf-stable, and we needed special packaging to keep it from spoiling, but some income is still better than none. Or none and a legal fiasco. Looking back, I would have taken that legal fiasco happily. Dr. Godor had been transferred to another office, so I didn't hear about him right away. He'd been depressed since the pica incident, and talked about quitting, but it was still strange that he'd just disappear. A police detective came by to ask us a few questions, but I got the impression he wasn't very optimistic. Bite the Bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Board articles. 2 weeks later, another member of the expedition team went missing. She just didn't show up one morning. The same detective came back around, but didn't seem to remember having talked to me before. He just gave the impression of general disinterest in the case. There was a lot of pica talk in the department. Both of those who'd vanished were recovered dirt munchers. It quickly became a department-wide rumor, the witchberry curse. One of the others who'd showed symptoms early on became so anxious that she simply quit, another went on extended vacation, and a third came into work high until he got a suspension. I never heard from any of them again. It was fall when I received a letter on my desk. I opened it to find a complaint from the Resource Management Office, upset that our department was using a greenhouse unit we hadn't requisitioned or been granted the use of, and that if we didn't move the new plantings, they would be destroyed. New plantings? I called Eugene Hanlon first, and then Maggie Hirschbaum, the only other people who might use the greenhouses for personal projects. Though even then, they'd have needed to apply for them with resource management. Neither of them admitted to knowing anything about it. I asked them to meet me at the unit mentioned in the letter, curious, and slightly irritated, about what was going on. I'd rarely even been in that unit, since it was out on the Endro, a long way from our crops. Even if I felt like putting anything in, there was no logical reason to go do it out there. After work, I hiked up to the last row of greenhouses and gray drizzle. Maggie was already there when I arrived, and Eugene made it only a few minutes after. The unit in question was unlit, and I flipped the switch so my companions could read the letter. They agreed it was odd, but sometimes our students get odd ideas for projects, and they're notorious for failing to follow procedure with some of these things. As promised, there were a number of seedlings growing in one of the plots. They were perhaps 7 or 8 inches tall, representing a couple weeks' growth. Healthy and robust despite being in an unheated, unlit unit. They had the elegant pink and green leaves of witchberry. Maybe someone's trying to selectively breed them. Eugene rubbed a leaf, make them hardier. Noble, but misguided. I noted a spade left on the floor in the aisle, and picked it up. We'll need to move them. Maggie, could you get a pallet? I remember pushing the spade into the soft, loose soil around the seedlings, working down and pulling up. I remember the rip of fabric, and when I lifted the spade, the dull sound of dirty brown bones coming up all tangled with the roots. I didn't recognize what I was seeing until I looked closer, down into the hole I'd made, and saw a human jawbone with still white teeth shining out of the dark, loamy earth. Advertisement. I think I went into shock at that point, since I don't recall much else of that night, and had to be filled in later by Maggie. Within an hour, police had swarmed the greenhouses. Eugene, Maggie and I were taken to a hotel and questioned repeatedly. I was in a daze, Maggie told me, and not very responsive. Forensic specialists dug up all the greenhouse plots with any sign of recent soil disturbance, including the original crop trees, which were moved into a storage facility in plastic tubs. The bones I had found had been those of Paul Dimsey, who had actually been the first of our expedition to go missing, but he wasn't an employee of the university, having been hired on contract, and he lived alone. I hadn't even known he'd gone absent. 5 corpses were found inside the greenhouses, and 3 more in some nearby woods, each one indicated by a small cluster of pink and green saplings. Evidence suggested that the deceased had actually buried themselves, sometimes using their bare hands to dig a hole big enough to lay in, and then pull the freshly turned earth back in over their own bodies. Of course, not everyone who'd eaten the seeds ended up in self-made graves. A couple were found decaying in their beds, with sprouts attempting to grow through the blankets. Others were still alive, but now experiencing fatigue and abdominal heaviness. And a good percentage showed no symptoms at all, regardless of how much of the fruit they'd eaten. CT scanning revealed what earlier tests and X-rays had missed. Some of the seeds, swallowed whole, had implanted themselves into the victim's intestinal walls, and germinated there. Invisible to the immune system, they'd quietly spread soft, fine roots all through the bodies of their human hosts, feeding and storing energy until they were ready to progress to the next stage. Somehow, the plants made their hosts want to bury themselves, their corpses providing fertilizer for the fast-growing trees. Efforts were made to remove the parasitic plants from the still living victims, but the surgery proved more deadly than the parasites. And worse, new cases of soil-eating pica were starting to emerge in every place we'd shipped the damn berries. A full recall was ordered, the fruit gathered and destroyed, but there was little way of knowing how many people ignored the recall, or had already been infected. Eugene and I went to be more thoroughly scanned, and again, we came up clean. We went for a few drinks to celebrate our one small mercy, and talked about the future. We were pretty certain the entire department was going to be scrapped. We'd be lucky to keep our jobs once the full legal repercussions came down on us. It would be the last time we'd see each other. It's quite amazing how efficient the media and government can be at hiding a crisis in plain sight. The public was scarcely aware of any of this happening. Witchberries vanished from collective awareness, and a few dozen people came down with an unrelated illness in each of the countries we'd shipped to. A cure was, in fact, discovered in time to save some of those people. There was a pattern to who did or did not get infected. The immune were all regular drinkers of hard liquor, like Eugene and myself. I don't know about Maggie, but I wouldn't be surprised. Beer or wine wasn't strong enough to kill the seeds, it had to be something at least 30 proof. Hospitals prescribed vodka and scotch, and patients drank to their health. Sadly, this came too late for some. Once they passed the pica stage, the growth in their bodies became resistant to treatment. Or, even if they did manage to kill the parasite, the damage it had done to the host's organs by that point was often irreversible and terminal. Some waited too long, or simply did not, or could not, seek medical treatment. This included a lot of people in the United States. who lacked any form of medical coverage. For those who got such a prognosis, suicide was vastly preferred over letting nature take its course, but the numbers didn't make much of a blip on the world radar. People kill themselves all the time. Witchberries are now illegal, though I'm certain there's a black market supplied by backyard growers. The cure for infection is now well-known folklore, and new cases of dirt-eating pica are rare. I've moved on, I don't work at the university anymore, I rarely travel, and I prefer meat and bread over greens. I do not eat fruit of any kind. And now and again, when I see a sapling coming up with pink and green leaves, I kill it. Credit to smoke, I kill it. Credit to smoke, I kill it. Credit to there have been few parts of my life that I remember in specific, lifelike detail. I'm not sure of this to be a blessing or a curse, as there are moments of my life I wish to forget completely. The most significant of which was the play. I'm being quite vague when I say, the play, as I've seen plenty of stage shows in my lifetime. Presentations in the form of movies usually bored me, but there was something about the stage that just made a show different. Live actors, so long as they were good, made the experience much more real to me, and ever since I saw my first stage play as a young boy, I was hooked. I moved to the city, and saw shows whenever I could. Some stage plays can be quite expensive, but money was never an issue for something I loved. However, I was especially drawn in when I saw the poster for The Hearts of the Young. I had seen the poster for the show on the streets, not too far from the popular stage theater in my city. What attracted many to this performance was that it was free. Sure, this brought on assumptions that it would be terrible, but who doesn't enjoy free entertainment? The show was being presented by the Masked Midnight Players, who I had never heard of. I had done some research on them prior to the show, but I couldn't find any information, which gave me the notion that they were a rather new group. Something I should mention before I go on is that the posters for the show became quite numerous. As the night of the show grew closer, it seemed as if I couldn't stroll down a single block without seeing an ad stating The Hearts of the Young. Free show. This Saturday. I know that a group should have the right to make themselves known, but it got a bit ridiculous in my eyes. They placed ads on cars, put flyers in every mailbox possible, and even put poster up on visible, but private property. This started to become a nuisance to some, until the day of the show finally came. The posters clearly had an effect, because word of the show had clearly got out. Despite the fact that the show started at a late time of 10:30 p.m., the theater was still rather crowded. Not as packed as I've seen it at other shows, but certainly more so than the average night. Since the show was free, it had no problem attracting its crowd. Even still, I wasn't at the highest of expectations for the production's quality. The time was 10:30, and the lights dimmed throughout the theater. Normally, a show would have a form of introduction at this point, but this show skipped it, as the curtains immediately opened to a live stage. The set for this scene was just a woman character, sitting on a chair in center stage. The woman wore a bright yellow dress, white gloves, and black high heels. This would all appear to be normal aside from what she was wearing on her face, a pink mask that presented the face of a woman with a repulsing amount of makeup. The mask didn't look professionally made, as in its makeup details were poorly smeared across, like it had been done in 5 minutes. The actress just sat in the chair on stage for about 10 seconds, staring at the audience, and then began to softly sob. Throughout the scene, the woman would appear to quickly glance to the left, off stage, looking at something, or someone. It didn't look like it was intended for the show, as she would turn back quickly as if she had done something wrong. This all happened for about 30 seconds, with the sobbing growing louder at random intervals. I was about to leave the theater right there, until the curtains closed, abruptly, for the next scene. Advertisement. The audience looked around in confusion. This was clearly going to be a poorly done play, but it was also going to be a rather strange one, which caught the attention of most. I had half a mind to not waste my time, but I thought I might as well see what else the production had to offer. The curtains opened again to reveal a scene very similar to the last. The same masked woman was sitting in a chair, crying. There was another actor though, who appeared to be male, so I'll address him as such. He wore a black formal suit, with a red and yellow tie that appeared very out of place for the rest of his outfit. He was masked too, but he wore a large gas mask as opposed to the female in the chair. He was just standing behind the woman in the chair, with his arms in front of him. Because of the mask, one obviously couldn't see his face, but I could sense a sort of expression on it regardless. It felt like he was anticipating something, occasionally looking down at the woman with intent. The stage was like this for about 20 seconds, then the curtains closed once again. At that moment, I had decided I was done. The show was different, sure, but I had better places I could waste my time. I was making my way to the exit, when the curtains opened to a completely different scene. The set change seemed way too fast, for the curtain was only closed for a few seconds before opening again. Everyone gasped at the sight. The same woman was on the stage, still in the chair, except she wasn't sobbing anymore. She was screaming. Her dress that the woman had been wearing was torn, with some visible cuts to her skin on her legs and torso. She was tied to the chair, and her screams sounded muffled, as if something was covering her mouth behind the mask. Around her were more actors and actresses, 11 in total, though it was hard to distinguish which ones were male or female. They all wore formal attire, similar to the gas mask man, who was now sitting at a piano near the left side of the stage. Bite the bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Board articles. The characters around the girl also wore masks, ranging from strange to downright hideous. The best way to describe them would be greatly disfigured faces, not torn apart, but arranged in completely inconceivable ways. Some had noses placed on the forehead, with large, bloodshot eyes placed where mouth should be. Others didn't have certain facial features at all, with just mouths or eyes scattered about. Their heads were all turned to the girl in the chair, in a manner of eager anticipation, if I had to guess. The gas mask actor looked at each one of the men and women surrounding the girl, and then looked into the audience. Then, he began to play the piano. He played an overly upbeat and obnoxious jingle tune. I haven't heard it before in my life, but it sounded very similar to a sort of annoying Christmas melody one would hear on the radio constantly. I only heard the specifics of the song for a moment, as the curtains closed a few seconds after. As the curtains were shut, the music still played, but it was drowned out by a series of stomps. Then sounds of struggle. It was a bearing of noises that all happened in a short time, so sorry if I'm not being very specific, but the woman's screams were more louder than any time before. There were sounds of the chair breaking to pieces, then the ambience of a crowd pushing and shoving each other. The audience began to gasp and scream themselves as there were very faint sounds of ripping, gnawing, and an occasional, aggressive growl from somebody behind the curtain. The woman's screams stopped after only a minute, perhaps less. Everybody in the theater was completely silent. Nobody knew what to think, of what the point of this production was, or if it was even an actual production at all. I was only hoping that it was some sort of organized joke, or a startlingly good show designed to make a sort of sadistic point. The piano tune still played before the next scene opened up, or what was left of it. The curtain opened to an empty stage, with the gas mask actor still at the piano. There were bloodied pieces of the chair on the center of the stage, with more red smears all around it. Aside from what appeared to be blood, there was no trace of the woman who was sitting there before. The gas mask man finished playing, and then walked towards center stage. He then looked at the stunned audience, bowed formally, and exited to the right of the stage. The curtains closed, and everybody was left silent. Advertisement. I suppose everyone was just as hopeful as I was to see some sort of conclusion to this so-called show, but there was none. Once the gas mask man left, that was it. The theater was filled with panicked whispers and calls to family and police. The police arrived quickly, did a quick investigation, and evacuated the theater. The theater was closed for more than a month after the incident. I had no intentions of seeing another show for a while, anyway. Following the night of the show, I of course had nightmares, as I imagined the entire audience did. I still clung to speculations that the show was still some sort of setup, made to scare its audience in the most realistic way possible. I almost fully believed this, until the authorities finally released a report on the incident. The crying and screaming woman, the one in the chair, was no actor. She was a woman who had gone missing shortly before the show. She had only been missing for a few hours, so there had been no reports of her missing. Nobody was able to identify her because of the mask she was wearing on stage, and her muffled voice was assumed to be because of a sort of mouth gag. The blood left on the stage was confirmed to be her own. The actors involved with the production have not been identified. When the police searched backstage after the show, no trace of the suspects was found, aside from a single note placed at the exit. The hearts of the young always taste best. Credit to Emery, Richard S. Then, dark thunderheads blanketed the Suffolk sky, and fat droplets of rain began to spatter the golden leaves scattered across the ground. In the distance, silver lightning streaked between the clouds above, illuminating rolling hills and terrified sheep scampering for shelter. Jack began to count the seconds as his father had taught him, barely reaching 8 before an enormous crack of thunder boomed across the sky. One of the cabinets in the study contained 4 or 5 model cannons, and he imagined this was how their functioning counterparts must have once sounded. He looked over his shoulder towards Nighthill Manor, his home, distant and aloof on the cusp of the valley, unsure if he was expected to go inside now that the weather had turned foul. Although, in truth, Jack didn't consider it foul at all. A storm like this would be perfect for playing soldiers. Anyway, his father would come and collect him in the jeep if he wanted Jack home early. He'd been shooting Nazis for about 10 minutes when he heard the bleeding. It was almost inaudible over the now considerable rumbling overhead, and it took Jack a few seconds to locate the source. There, just beyond the fence marking the border of King's Forest, in a dense patch of withered brown bracken. He squinted against the rain, and a pair of twisted horns resolved themselves, curving down around a head covered in shaggy black fur. He didn't need to see the snap tip of one of the horns to recognize the visitor. "Sebastian!" Jack shouted, dropping his plastic Luger in the grass and hurrying over to the fence, all thoughts of war and soldiers pushed aside by the delight of the sudden reappearance of his friend. It had been over 3 weeks since he'd woken up to find the goat absent from its pen. His father had merely grumbled about loose latches and set Maxwell to fitting a new gate, convinced the marauding animal would make its way home in due course. But to Jack, after Jiminy Cricket and Pinocchio's escape the week before, Sebastian's disappearance had upset him quite considerably. So it was with no hesitation that he scrambled over the wire fence and followed the retreating goat into the forest. He'd been walking for quite a while, picking his way through autumnal foliage and around withered trees with only fleeting glimpses of Sebastian's shaggy head to guide him, when he stepped into the clearing. As he did so, a deafening peal of thunder sounded above, and he flinched despite himself. Then he noticed the long, low table standing in the middle of the clearing, and when he saw the pair seated at it side by side, he began to smile. Jiminy Cricket, holding a pink floral teacup in one furry paw, a dark green flat cap cocked back on his head and a yellow scarf fluttering gently in the breeze, and Pinocchio, who looked simply marvelous in a deep burgundy waistcoat, top hat and matching cravat. The hares twitched their heads to regard Jack as he took a few tentative steps across the clearing, and Pinocchio motioned stiffly with a thin foreleg for him to join them at the table. There were others there who Jack didn't recognize, a grinning fox whose tooth-filled snout poked out from beneath a black-trimmed fedora, a slim white ferret, similar to those that Maxwell kept behind the stables, stared at him with glazed yellow eyes as it sipped from a teacup. Something that looked like a small monkey crouched at the opposite end of the table, its human-like features obscured beneath falls of lace and a frilled pink bonnet. Jack sat down in the only empty seat, opposite Jiminy Cricket and Pinocchio, beside a large badger, its snouted face dominated by pale white eyes, and a tabby and white cat with long drooping whiskers. Behind Cricket and Pinocchio stood a huge tree with withered, drooping branches and a hollow trunk. Sebastian's face was barely visible in the darkened hollow, but his dull red eyes winked in the gloom and Jack waved for him to come out. The goat seemed reluctant to leave, however, and shook its head in response, retreating further into the murk. Something cold and filthy with bristles touched Jack's hand, and he instantly recoiled before realizing that it was only Jiminy Cricket, reaching across the table to place his diminutive paw on top of Jack's equally tiny hand. The hare's mouth pulled back in a lopsided grin, and the boy smiled back. So engrossed was he as the hare showed him the plates and cups and teapots and cutlery lining the table, that he didn't hear the dried-out leaves crunching behind him. A gloved hand clamped over his mouth and a strong arm wrapped itself around him, yanking his hand away from Jiminy Cricket's and pulling him down into the darkness. Now, Martin dreamt of music, soft and distant, but beautiful nonetheless. Faint noises in the corridor roused him from his fitful slumber. Was that a pair of tiny feet slapping against the plush maroon carpet, a slight form running past the slightly ajar bedroom door? No, of course it wasn't. Maxwell would have retired to bed by now, and even if he hadn't, the boxer-turned-groundskeeper's days of running anywhere were long since past. Nobody ran in Nighthill Manor's paneled corridors now. Not for almost a year. Not since Jack. Oh God. Martin swung his legs out of bed, elbows resting on his thighs, put his head in his hands and began to cry. Advertisement. He should have sent Maxwell to fetch Jack that day. He should never have let him play so far from the manor in the first place. Without Maria, he hadn't had a clue how to care for their son. When he was young, his parents had let him roam far and wide, so it was his natural assumption that Jack should be allowed to do the same. Of course, back then pedophiles and child murderers had been relatively unheard of. The world had changed, but Martin hadn't changed with it. Raising his head, he looked around the room, the Napoleonic oil paintings, the gilded furniture, the gold-trimmed oak paneling. Even this god-forsaken manor house. He'd tear it all down with his bare hands if it would bring Jack back. Standing, he crossed to the window, which opened onto Nighthill Manor's rear garden and the valley beyond. And the woods. The woods where, detectives reasoned, his only son had been stolen from him forever. Martin's breath caught in his throat, and he felt as though an ethereal hand had reached into his chest and taken hold of his heart. About halfway down the valley, moving away from the house towards the woods, was a bobbing orange light, a lantern. Martin narrowed his eyes, but was unable to discern the shape or size of whoever was carrying it. Maxwell? No. The elderly man wouldn't risk the valley with its holes and pitfalls at this hour. He would know better. There was no need for either of them to go into the woods at all, let alone this late at night. Martin wasted no time at all in scrambling into a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, pulling on his jacket as he hurtled down the sweeping spiral staircase to the entrance hall. On his way to the front doors, he passed a dark shape against the far wall, frozen in a stream of moonlight. The piano. His son's piano. Oh Jack, he thought as he pulled on his walking boots. Oh Jack, I'm so sorry. He had his hand on the antique silver door handle when his mind fully registered what he'd just seen. The piano, yes. But he'd actually seen the piano, seen its polished teak surface and ivory keys, bright white like rows of teeth. Nobody had touched the piano since Jack. Maxwell had thoughtfully covered the beautiful instrument with a thick velvet sheet, and that was how it had stayed. Now, the sheet was moved on the floor to the right of the piano, yanked aside and left where it had fallen. Rage welled up inside Martin like a ferocious storm. Somebody had been here, in his house. But that intrusion paled in comparison to the fact that the intruder had touched his son's piano. He snatched the door open and dashed out into the night. From the shadow doorway to the dining room, a pair of burnished yellow eyes watched the man leave. Satisfied, the stoat slipped out the same way it had entered, through the kitchen. Its breathing was torn and ragged, its blackened tongue lolling from a mouth bursting with needle-sharp teeth. The faint groan of shifting wood and the near inaudible hum of whirring gears followed it through the darkness. The woods were black as pitch, and Martin cursed himself a fool for not bringing a torch. He lost sight of the orange light when it disappeared into the clusters of spindly trees, and now he caught only the merest snatches of its flickering glow in the distance. His shins were bleeding and he'd cut his face the first time he'd fallen, but that didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Nothing except catching whoever it was that had defiled his precious memories of Jack. The only things he had left. Bite the Bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Bored articles. There was a definite awareness of perception here. He cautiously scanned his surroundings for inquisitive eyes. Something moved in the bracken off to the left, but by the time he'd snapped his head in that direction the motion had ceased. The light reappeared, directly ahead of him, and he hurried towards it. He kept low to the ground, moving as silently as possible, but was almost shocked into screaming when something sleek and furry brushed past his legs before vanishing into the undergrowth. Composing himself and breathing deeply, he stepped into a clearing that had once been flooded with yellow tape and ultraviolet light. There, beneath the eaves of a drooping willow where he'd held a distraught Maria as forensic teams combed the area, was a table. Pink plastic with garish chairs to match. It was the sort one would expect to see at a little girl's tea party, were it not so stained and filthy. It wasn't the table that snatched the breath from Martin's lungs, nor was it the chairs. It was the slumped form seated upon them. The lantern he'd seen the figure carrying had been placed on the table and its flickering light illuminated his surroundings with sickening clarity. As he stepped closer, Martin raised a hand to cover his mouth. Dear God, the stench was enough to make him vomit. The warm, welcoming glow of the lantern belied its surroundings. The things at the table were monstrosities. The closest of them was an egregious fox, a fedora perched almost comically atop its head and a grimy plastic fork in its hand. What the devil was going on here? There was a bloody fox in Dash. About to turn away, Martin frowns. Its hand. Since when did foxes have hands? Against his better judgment, he looked back down. A swollen fly crawled across the small pale hand protruding from the sleeve of the fox's tweed jacket. The flesh had blackened in places, sloughing away to reveal glimpses of yellowing bone. It had a strange, burnished finish to it. Steeling himself, he reached forward and tugged the fox's sleeve back. The wrist, so tiny he could have encircled it with thumb and forefinger, ended in jagged stitches an inch or so from the hand. The remainder of the arm to be seen was thin and covered in glossy red fur. He stumbled away in horror, screaming aloud as he backed straight into the fox's neighbor, an abominable hare with a jaundiced yellow scarf wrapped tightly around its neck. It tumbled out of its seat and hung in the air. The air itself seemed to pull taut. Wires, so fine as to be almost imperceptible, ran from every major joint of the hare's body, up into the branches of the willow, suspending it in midair like some deplorable puppet. The wires hung from the willow's branches like a giant spider web, ascending to lofty heights before descending the trunk and disappearing into the darkness of the hollow. The scarf slipped from the hare's neck and fluttered to the ground. Martin fell to his knees and vomited. Its head was nestled atop the stump of a human neck, rudimentary stitching holding the animal's furred cheeks in place. Needing to tear his eyes away from the bloodless, marble-like neck, he looked up at the hare's face. Realization smashed into him like a sledgehammer. Jiminy Cricket. It could be any hare, of course, but Martin knew that it wasn't. He stumbled to his feet, standing groggily on legs threatening to give way any second. Advertisement. Pinocchio's paw jerked into motion, sending a rigid wave across the table to Martin. He screamed and staggered backwards. The police. He needed to call the police. In the willow's hollow trunk, twigs cracked underfoot. Martin exploded over the table in a spray of cheap plastic dinnerware, nausea and law enforcement forgotten, knocking Pinocchio aside and crashing into a monstrous, monocle-wearing pig. He shoved the thing away in disgust, repulsed at the feel of its clammy skin, snatched the lantern from the table and squeezed into the hollow. The stench was overwhelming. One summer, when he was a boy, he'd visited his uncle's slaughterhouse. Beneath the scorching August sun, the odor of decaying flesh had infested every inch of the place. This was worse. Martin immediately saw why. Leaning against the wall was a long metal pole. Impaled upon its tip was a goat's head. He knew it was Sebastian without even looking. Aligned vertically next to it, a row of wooden levers and cogs, so that was where the wires led. Dear God, how long had this maniac been watching his family? He raised the lantern higher and answered his own question. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of Polaroids were pinned to the inside of the stump, Jack laughing and petting Sebastian, Jack standing on Martin's shoulders, wearing his Spider-Man t-shirt and waving an ice cream above his head. They had been taken from the edge of the tray line, judging by their angles. The next photo turned Martin's blood to ice. Wrapped in a duvet adorned with purple dinosaurs, Jack dozed peacefully. One hand was clutching the duvet. The other was snaked around Martin's shoulders as the two of them dozed peacefully. That had been on Jack's 4th birthday. Oh God. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he took in the twisted visual history spread before him. 2 A4-sized photos were tacked in the center. Martin howled in agony. The first showed Jack, wearing the same khaki shorts and brown t-shirt as the day he'd disappeared. He was laying on his back, pale and motionless, eyes closed and hands clasped on his chest. Next to him was a pig, bloated and bloody. Beneath them both was a sheet of light blue tarpaulin. Between them, small clear bags of what looked like sawdust, tiny blocks of wood and a pile of minuscule cogs and gears. In the second, Martin lay sleeping in his own bed. Standing beside him, staring fixedly at his prone form, was a monocle-wearing pig. The photograph was dated September 22nd. Today. Something shuffled behind him, fallen leaves crunching beneath its cloven hooves. Martin couldn't turn to face it, couldn't even move. Silence. He stood in the reeking hollow with his heart thudding in his ears. The lantern slipped from his grasp, and something was pressed into his palm to replace it. Holding the plastic Luger in a white-knuckle grip, Martin sank to his knees. Small arms enfolded him from behind and a cold snout pressed itself against the back of his neck. The subtle click of hidden machinery was followed by a shallow breath. From the darkness, a rasping voice. Father. Credit to Tom Farr, Father. Credit to Tom Farr, Father. Credit. My aunt was a kind and benevolent woman. She was widowed, but never allowed her situation to get the better of her. She had a stern outlook on rules and etiquette, but a heart of platinum. She gave to charity even when she barely had enough for herself, and she was loved by everyone. Except for me. My aunt wore a disguise. Her facade was so convincing I would love her for many years before. Back in the days before, I would often visit my aunt's old house by the sea and would always be thrilled for the opportunity. She was an elder, but her house was never a bore. It was filled to the brim with knickknacks and photo albums. Some in the town called her a hoarder, but she always preferred to be called a collector. A collector of memories, she would often tell me as we sat by the warmth of the fire that always bellowed in its stone cage. I would sit on the carpeted floor and listen quietly as she strung tales of the adventures of her youth. The stories of my young aunt clashed heavily with the frail figure I now saw rocking back and forth in her chair. I was hooked on her stories and would not let her take me to my bed before hearing at least one. She also gave me free range in her home, and there was plenty to explore. Her house had been built during the years of Prohibition, and the old place had been equipped with various nooks and crannies and the occasional hidden room or tunnel. The secret rooms were always dusty and filled with relics of years past. Whenever I asked her about a bottle cap or playbill I found littering the floors of the hidden storage spaces, she would only tell me, "Oh, sweetie, you know me. I never throw anything away." Then she would laugh and send me off with a sandwich or an apple in hand to go play some more. I said before that she gave me free range of her house, but to be honest, that was not completely true. There was one room that she forbade me from entering. "The basement is too old and dangerous, sweetie, you mustn't ever venture down there. Do you understand? I would always smile and nod yes before going off on another adventure. Not that I forgot the room, I would often wonder what lay behind the old oak door that blocked me from my potential exploration. The door was always locked, though, and I would lose interest very quickly. That is how things went for a while until she started to show signs of mental illness. She began forgetting things. Small things at first. Where she left her keys or that she had already bought eggs the day before. She still smiled through it all and would often dismiss her troubles by giving a simple silly "me, my head is full of rocks." Although she never forgot her mantra "I never throw anything away," and would continue to tell me the stories attached to each object in her collection. Advertisement. Her mental state slowly slipped away until she couldn't even remember my name, let alone her own. I was in my early 20s by this point, but I continued to visit my beloved aunt up until the day she finally died from her illnesses. On one of the last days I spoke to her, she was sitting in her chair by the fire as she had many times before and mumbling to herself, "Harold, Harold, Harold." She was muttering my late uncle's name over and over again. I knew little about my uncle, because he was one of the few topics she never spoke about, and to hear his name escape her lips for the first time since I could remember was shocking. "Auntie, do you want to say something about Uncle Harry?" I leaned in close and watched as a crooked smile went across her lips. Her teeth were yellow and brown in spots and obviously decaying with her age. She laughed for seemingly no reason and let out a raspy "I never throw anything away, child, never." Then she just stared off into space and wouldn't answer me. A few days later she died at the town's hospital and we buried her the next day. Preparations had been in place for some time and the whole ordeal was over pretty quickly. I learned a few weeks later that she had left the old house to me. I was very excited. This house meant the world to me and I decided to move in as soon as possible. I moved in a few days later and carried my bags up to what had once been my designated bedroom for when I visited. After all the boxes had been carried up, I decided to look around my old playing ground. It was relatively the same as before, but age had withered it some. It would need some work, but I was up to the task if it was to restore my aunt home. I spent the next few weeks dusting and patching up the place and made a good amount of progress. The place was starting to look like it had 15 years ago. Her old knickknacks still crowded every shelf and mantel in the house, and that was just how I wanted it. The only issue I had, though, was that at night the house made noises. I tried to tell myself they were just the sound of an old house settling and that I should ignore it. The sounds kept me awake, however. I swore at times it sounded like rattling coming from the depths of the old estate. I even thought I heard grunts and voices at one point. This went on every night for weeks and I was getting less and less sleep. One day while I was finishing up cleaning, I noticed for the first time in years, the old basement door. I had grown so accustomed to it being off limits that I hadn't even acknowledged it this entire time. However, now this was my house and I had a right to finally see what secrets it held. Besides, I had to clean that room as well as the others. The door, however, was surely locked as it had been for years. I then caught sight of something shiny sitting atop the door frame. I was a lot taller now than I had been as a child and assumed that is why I had not seen it before. I reached up and brought down a brass key. The key's appearance conflicted with the rest of the house as it was shiny and polished without a speck of dust on it. I slid the old key into the lock of the basement door and the tumblers moved with ease. The door creaked open and I was presented with wooden stairs that descended into darkness. I flicked the light switch on the wall, but a fuse must have been blown, because I was still staring at a black pit. I rushed and got a flashlight from my tool bag and was relieved to find the batteries were still in working order. I shined the white ball of light into the basement and saw that the stairs themselves looked as if dust had been kicked around and the handrail was wiped clean. I descended the stairs and flicked my light from one side of the room to another. The room was filled with what seemed to be old science equipment. Beakers and test tubes littered the tables and jars filled with various liquids and gels sat on the shelves. I wondered if my aunt had helped some old high school clean out their old science gear or something and was quite surprised to find this kind of stuff in her basement. There were other drawers on the back shelves that seemed to hold organic tissue of some sort. I guess it was probably from frogs or pig fetuses, as those were used in high school science classes sometimes. Bite the Bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Board articles. Then my light landed on what appeared to be a large black box in the middle of the room. It was locked and I could see that little dust had fallen on it. I finally put together that my aunt must have been coming down here regularly when I went to sleep, hence why some of these objects had not been left alone long enough to gather dust. I walked towards the box and gave it a light kick. Perhaps it was something from her travels? Or maybe it was just a bundle of old clothes she had put away for a rainy day. As I kicked the box, it moved. It moved not in the way an inanimate object moves when force is applied to it, but as if something had moved from inside. I kicked it lightly again and it shook more violently this time. I thought I heard noises coming from the black mysterious object. The sounds seemed inhuman in nature and were mostly grunts and moans. The box was shaking more wildly now and I assumed that some animal had gotten stuck in it. My heart was pounding and my eyes were wide. I could feel my palms becoming clammy and sweat rolled down my cheek. This whole experience was so weird, so bizarre that I had no idea how to handle it. I saw that the box was locked with a sliding lock and I walked gingerly towards it. My hand was shaking but I managed to grab a hold of the latch and slide it so as to unlock the box. The lid flung open and a black figure sprang up. I screamed. Or at least I tried, and I fell backwards on my butt in the dusty ground. My flashlight fell from my hands and rolled away and I turned to bolt up the stairs that would lead me away from the horrid basement. I ran and ran until I was through the door frame. I slammed the door behind me and locked it with the key that I had somehow managed to keep in hand. I felt a hard impact from the other side and my ears were polluted with the vile sounds of inhuman groans and the scratching of nails against wood. I ran to the phone and called the police. Advertisement. By the time the authorities got to the house, the noises had ceased. When they opened the door, they found the thing had left long bloody scratch marks on the other side of the door. There were even some broken fingernails lodged in the wood. When they ventured further, they found the body of the creature I had ran from in the dark. It had apparently died sometime between jumping out of the box and now. It was a man. His body was badly mutilated and was barely able to tell he was male. His skin was black and flaky and charred as if he had been in a fire. His eyelids and lips had been cut away and his tongue removed. One of his arms had been completely severed at the elbow and the autopsy revealed some minor organs had been removed. His genitals were horribly mangled and his bones showed signs of multiple breaks. His remaining teeth were cracked and jagged as if hit by a hammer. He had no hair, as it had probably been burnt off in whatever fire had destroyed his skin. He had no toes on one foot and only half his fingers on his remaining hand. There were various chemicals found in his system that told us that he had gone through several heinous injections. He was nude except for a medical bracelet that had been fused to his wrist in the heat of the flames that had scarred him. It read Harold. Upon hearing this, I immediately remembered my aunt's favorite mantra and my stomach became weak. I never throw anything away. My uncle had gone missing over 15 years ago and was presumed dead. I never thought I would ever meet him. Old journals were found in the basement that revealed that my aunt's mental illness was worse than we could have ever imagined. It turns out that she thought her actions were justified under orders from God. She thought it was her duty to cleanse my uncle's soul through continuous suffering and had tracked him down in the basement and tortured him for years. When I went down and unknowingly opened the door of his cage, he wasn't trying to chase me, but rather he was trying to escape the hell he had been confined to for 15 years. And I locked him there. I had kept him in the basement and he died, never being able to see the light of day again. He died in the same hell he wanted nothing more than to escape from. I carry that guilt with me forever. I put her house for sale afterwards, but no one wanted to buy the house of the murderous woman who kept her husband in a box. The house burned down some years after. No one is sure if it was arson or an accident, but I didn't care. When I heard the news, I smiled. I still have the key, though. A reminder that you can't trust those you love the most at face value. A reminder that the person you hold in highest regard could be a devil in disguise. Besides, despite my animosity towards my aunt, I cannot get myself to get rid of the key. After all, I never throw anything away. Credit to Clever Boy away. Credit to Clever Boy away.